Hello and welcome to the WIHS Journal Public Affairs program. I'm Gerry Williams. Well, it's Black History Month, and today you'll hear about Prudence Crandall, an amazing woman who was arrested for setting up the first school for black girls. Hear about her life and legacy for the next 3 days as told by another Crandall, Vice President of WIHS, Drew Crandall. Hear that and more happening now on the WIHS Journal. It's News and Public Affairs.
All right, let's talk about how the Crandalls first came over here and the significance of Crandalls in New England.
Sure. Reverend John Crandall came over in 1634. He was a Puritan preacher. He landed in Boston, and he was a preacher during that first year in the Boston area. Just like the Puritans you read about, who we celebrate on Thanksgiving Day on Cape Cod there in Plymouth, life was very difficult. At the end of that first year, a third of the people in his party died, a third of the people returned to England, and a third stayed. He eventually met Roger Williams and became a Baptist, and he migrated to what became Providence. He and Roger Williams and others helped to found the very first Baptist church in America, which still exists in Providence today. And then he was a Baptist preacher in Newport, and then he migrated west to what became Westerly, and he was one of the founders of Westerly and one of the founders of the colony of Rhode Island. So we have a great family heritage going back almost 400 years here in New England.
Drew Crandall with us, dear brother in the Lord, Vice President of WIHS. It's Black History Month, and Prudence Crandall, she started an all-black school. Give us some history about Prudence.
Sure. The home base for the Crandall family is the Westerly, Rhode Island area. There's an interesting story. If you look at the boundary between Rhode Island and Connecticut, it's a straight line until it gets to Westerly. And then it follows the contour of the river. And Reverend John is why. The state of Connecticut tried to bully him, wanted to annex that part of Rhode Island to become part of Connecticut. They actually arrested him and put him in prison, and he wouldn't budge. Otherwise, Musquamacut and Watch Hill would be part of Connecticut. But anyway, Prudence was born in Hopkinton, Rhode Island, which is right near Westerly. She was raised with a Christian worldview as a Baptist. She moved to Connecticut when her dad bought a farm in Canterbury in 1813. And if you study her life, you can see, almost like studying the life of David, the shepherd boy, how God prepared David to someday face Goliath. Well, in a similar kind of way, you can see a pattern where the Lord put the influences, the people, the experiences in Prudence's life to lead her to a point where she could actually do things in a very courageous way and literally centuries later become Connecticut's official heroine. So what she did, she opened up a private school for girls. It was originally called the Canterbury Female Seminary. And the private school was thriving. She bought this home right in Canterbury, Connecticut, at the junction of Route 14 and 169, and it was prospering. And that in itself was very unusual back in that day for a young single woman to actually become a business owner. And she actually was a rising star in Canterbury, very well esteemed in town. She had a 20-year-old assistant, Sarah Harris, who was an African-American girl, and Sarah asked if she could enroll in the school. And Prudence knew that it might be a controversial kind of decision, so she said, let me think about that, and she did, and the Lord gave her Ecclesiastes 4:1 and inspired her to do what she did, which is allow Sarah Harris to become an official student in the school. And she really did not anticipate the backlash that she got. And even in Canterbury, Connecticut, and eastern Connecticut, she really was tormented because of that choice. And she was harassed, and her school was harassed, and so I'm making a long story a little short here, but she actually made the choice, well, if they're going to do that, then I'm going to turn this school into a school for all black girls, not just one.
Right.
So she made it an all-black school, and the people went ballistic.
Right.
And she was actually not allowed to go to church where she went to church. And one of her neighbors was very influential in state government, and he lobbied for a new law to be passed by the Connecticut legislature prohibiting what she was doing, and it actually passed. And she was arrested, and she actually went to court in Brooklyn, Connecticut, north of Canterbury. And her legal case, she had almost like a dream team of lawyers. She was very much supported by the folks in the abolitionist movement. So while all these negative things happened, you could see there were also people rallying to her side. But Donald Williams used to be in state government here in Connecticut, one of the leaders in state government. He was so inspired by the Prudence Crandall story years ago that he actually went on this amazing journey to study her life through the prism of a lawyer. And he published a book a couple years ago, published by the Wesleyan Press in Middletown, which is amazing. Her case was the first full-throttle civil rights case in the history of the United States. And it came out of Canterbury, Connecticut, Brooklyn, Connecticut. And the legal defenses in her case were part of what led to the amendment to the Constitution about civil rights and major civil rights legislation in the 1800s and 1900s. All that from this single, spunky Christian woman, business owner in Canterbury, Connecticut, who stood on principle when you think of it, she could have had a good thing going. The school was prospering. And back then, private schools were very popular across the country. And if she had just behaved herself, she could have had a good thing going there for conceivably the rest of her life. She could have operated that private school. But because she chose and she was inspired by the Holy Spirit to take a stand against racism and slavery, the school actually didn't last too long because of the harassment. She was concerned for the safety of the students. So she actually closed the school, ended up leaving Connecticut, moved to upstate New York, and then she moved to Illinois, and then she eventually moved to Kansas, where she spent her final years, and that's where she's buried.
You said she's from Hopkinton, Rhode Island. Yep. It's interesting you say that because for several years I drove a Saab, and I would drive from Connecticut to Hopkinton, Rhode Island, for my Saab to be serviced. Wayne's World of Saabs is where he is in Hopkinton, Rhode Island. So I'm familiar with Hopkinton. It's about an hour and 10 minutes from Hartford.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, people, when they think of slavery, they think of down south with the cotton plantations. But Connecticut did not have the overt slavery that existed in the Deep South. But as far as the historical records show, in 1800, Connecticut had 951 slaves.
Wow.
And by 1830, which is about her time, that number had decreased to 25. But the economy here in New England did get boosted by the slave trade. The economy here benefited from shipbuilding, the transportation of slaves, raw materials used in the mills, and rum that was traded for slaves in Africa. So we like to think up here in the Northeast that we didn't really have a role in slavery and the slave trade, but that's not necessarily so. It wasn't as prevalent as down south, but we played our role as well.
If you're just joining us, I'm with Drew Crandall, Vice President of WIHS, and we're talking about the life and legacy of Prudence Crandall.
She was also very much exposed to the Quakers. She went to a private Quaker school, and the Quakers are very strong against things like slavery, and they're sort of passive. They are a component of the wider Christian body. And, back in her day, this happened in the early 1830s when she had her experience here. Well, the Second Great Awakening was happening in eastern Connecticut around that time. And the historical record shows that she actually was immersion baptized in the Quinnebog River.
Wow.
Just a short time before she did this. She was part of the Packerville Baptist Church, which still exists today.
Wow.
So I believe there's enough historical evidence between her own writings and the other records that she not only grew up with a Christian heritage, but her faith in Jesus Christ was real and personal.
And you just heard my conversation with Vice President of WIHS, Drew Crandall, talking about the life and legacy of Prudence Crandall. Join me tomorrow at this same time for part 2. If you would like more information about what you heard today, call WIHS 860-346-1049, 860-346-1049. I'm Gerry Williams for the WIHS Journal Public Affairs program at 104.9 FM WIHS in Middletown.